Imagine yourself as a European living in June 1914. You're middle class, wealthy enough to get by and purchase your local newspaper, but not an aristocrat either. You're living in peace in your community, surrounded by your friends and family, yet this air of unease is constantly felt. Then suddenly, you hear the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand while reading the newspaper on the morning of the 29th. Soon, the situation escalates, and over the next month, the entire continent goes up in flames. France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Serbia, Montenegro, none of them were spared. Soon you hear the news that you are being drafted, and within the following weeks you are sent to the front lines to fight. This may seem like an over-dramatization, but this was exactly what millions of young men in Europe went through. In such a short time, Europe had gone into war, and the entangling alliances that had been formed across the continent would continually bring more and more countries into the conflict. Tensions had been rising across Europe for the last few decades, which had made a war inevitable. By the early 1910s, it was no longer a question of if a war would break out, but of when and under what exact circumstances. The rise of nationalism throughout the continent, Germany's aggressive foreign policy, and fear of imperial domination had created these tense conditions, and in July 1914 they would blow up and this war would rise from the ashes. These events that happened in July 1914 are known as the July Crisis, and it is a fitting name considering what it started. The beginning of the war came when Austria-Hungary declared war upon Serbia. The killer of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist who wanted to create a unified state for all southern Slavic peoples. Something that was made impossible by all the Slavic lands the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled. The Austrians blamed Serbia for Princip's actions and sent an ultimatum to the country with a list of 10 demands. The Austrians did this after having received a blank check from the German Empire, in which they promised to assist Austria-Hungary were a war to break out. Despite how harsh these demands were, Serbia was willing to accept all of them, except for a single one. This wasn't enough for the Austrians though, and the Emperor Franz Joseph declared war upon the Kingdom of Serbia. Montenegro, which had long been a strong Serbian ally, would enter the war in early August. The Austro-German alliance had gone back longer than any other in this war, dating back to 1879. A decade earlier in 1866, there had been a war between the North German Confederation and the Austrian Empire, one which the Germans successfully won in only 7 weeks. Austria had been utterly defeated, but Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor, intentionally kept the terms lenient, not wishing to alienate the Austrians too much. This plan was well thought, as only a decade later the two countries agreed to the dual alliance, forming the Central Powers. In power, Bismarck had kept up good relations with the Russians, fearing a war on 2 fronts, but after he was dismissed by Emperor Wilhelm II in March 1890, Germany adopted a much more aggressive foreign policy, fearing Russia would become so powerful it would dominate Europe without competition. This aggression is what pushed Russia into the arms of France. Relations between France and Russia had long been hurt by Napoleon's invasion at the start of the 19th century, and more recently in the Crimean War, when France and Britain launched a naval invasion of the Russian Empire in order to stop an invasion Russia had launched against the Ottoman Turks. Despite all this, a common fear of Germany's rise to power had brought France and Russia together. This alliance was signed in secret and had originally been forged by the influence of French businessmen in several Russian industries, most notably journalism. France had spited Germany from its inception, as the catalyst that managed to make Germany unify had been a war against France, which united all the German states against a foreign enemy. This war ended in German victory, in which Alsace-Lorraine, a piece of land that had been French for centuries, was annexed. The bitterness over the loss of this territory became a rallying cry for many in France and ensured animosity for Germany. Eventual reconquest of these lost provinces became an article of faith for many French politicians, including Raymond Poincaré, the French president at the start of the war. This alliance emboldened Russia to move its attention towards the Balkans, at the same time that the Austro-Hungarian Empire felt the same thing, feeling emboldened by its alliance with Germany. This naturally led to Russia vowing to protect its fellow Slavs in the Balkans from threats of Austrian expansion, a feeling that these Balkan powers reciprocated considering Russia's role in many of them having gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. This meant that when Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, Russian leadership had no doubts about defending the country. The start of Russia's mobilization triggered the ire of Germany, who would declare war on the country. This motivated France to quickly begin its own mobilization, which brought the ire of Germany against it. Germany sent an ultimatum threatening war with France if it did not stop mobilizing, but French leadership refused, and war was declared. The Great War had begun in earnest. France, however, was ready. In the wake of the July Crisis, Prime Minister René Viviani assembled a new cabinet, one that included every single party in the House of Deputies, including the Socialists, who prior to the war had been the leading anti-war voice. This had come just after the equally surprising move of the French Parliament overwhelmingly approving the creation of an income tax to fund the war, which had been among the most controversial political debates of the previous 40 years. It wasn't just the politicians, however, that entered the spirit of war, as going into the war, the French people had a patriotism so strong that it would make modern audiences shudder. Frenchmen enlisted by the millions, with boys as young as 12 successfully lying about their ages to be admitted. All of France was unified in the cause of defeating Germany. The Germans, however, had already assembled a plan for rapid victory. It was called the Schlieffen Plan, named after German General Alfred von Schlieffen, who devised it. The Germans knew that Russia had an inefficient army and would therefore take long to mobilize. It was thus planned that Germany would quickly knock out France by invading Belgium and quickly seizing Paris. This was meant to be done before Russia was done mobilizing, which would then allow the Germans to turn their entire force against Russia and crush them utterly. It would only be a day after the declaration on France that the Germans occupied the entire country of Luxembourg, followed by issuing an ultimatum to Albert I, King of the Belgians, asking for military access for German troops throughout Belgium. In a move that shocked many in German leadership, Albert refused this access in an address he gave before the Belgian parliament, a move that forced German troops to invade the country. This action proved a massive mistake as it brought Great Britain into the war. France and the UK had slowly come to be on good terms by this point, but none of the agreements they had signed were binding. The two had recognized each other's colonial holdings, and in the Entente Cordiale agreements in 1904 they had agreed to work together in foreign diplomacy, but nothing agreed between the two represented a formal alliance, and especially not a promise of mutually assured defense. Yet with Belgium it was different. From the end of the Belgian Revolution, Britain had ensured that the country would remain neutral, and this came with a guarantee of defense, in which Britain promised to defend Belgium from any invader. Germany had just become the first country to breach that guarantee, and so in the British troops went. What followed was a month of disasters for the Entente powers, as Germany's invasion proved very successful. The Germans faced fierce resistance from Belgian forces, which slowed down the invasion, but it was nowhere near enough, and most of the country would soon come under German occupation, with Brussels falling within less than 3 weeks. On the French front, things proved disastrous too, as the Germans successfully broke through the German defense on the Alsatian border and pushed further into Lorraine, also thwarting a planned dual invasion the French had planned across the same border. Many French soldiers became so desperate that many resorted to scorching villages along the front lines just to slow down the German advance. By early September, the Germans had made it to just 25 miles from Paris. Hopes the Schlieffen Plan could be achieved were high, as the Germans showed no sign of slowing their advance. Fearing for the worst, 700,000 Parisians had fled the city. The government in Paris appeared to see the writing on the wall and relocated to Bordeaux, which the Germans had no ability to seize. The British forces led by Field Marshal John French even began to organize an evacuation back to Britain. French leadership, however, did all it could to prevent a seizure of Paris. A repeat of the Franco-Prussian War could not be allowed. Having retreated all the way back to the Marne River Valley, Joseph Joffre, the army's chief of staff, ordered an offensive against the Germans on September 5th. What followed was a brutal week of fighting, with both sides fighting tooth and nail, but slowly and surely the Allied powers were beginning to push back the Germans. The battle would end as the first major victory for the Allies, as the Germans were pushed back a respectable 40 to 50 miles. Paris had been saved. The war was not yet lost. His victory had been great, but it would be the only one for a very long time. Yet that did not mean the Germans would be pushing any further either. The war stagnated, and the front line that stretched from the English Channel all the way down to Switzerland established after the Battle of the Marne would remain almost unchanged for the next couple of years. This is where the trench warfare that World War I is so famous for began. This was caused by the fact that defense's military technology had developed much faster than offensive technology over the past few decades, which gave the defense the military advantage in nearly all situations. Not only that, but the Russians had finished mobilizing at this time, which meant that the Germans would have to divide their forces more evenly between both the eastern and western fronts, which killed any hopes of a Schlieffen Plan being quickly achieved. It wasn't long before soldiers dug holes for them to be protected from a constant gunfire, and these various holes would be combined together to form the famous trenches. Barbed fences would soon be erected on each side to make any attempts of invasion even more futile. From this point, the front lines could only budge if one side managed to successfully overrun an opposing trench, forcing the other side to retreat and form another trench system. Such events were rare, however, and thousands of lives would be sacrificed for minuscule movements in the front lines. The cultural effects that these conditions had on soldiers was enormous. Never had Europeans in such a large numbers been separated from their families and homes for such a long period of time. This naturally caused many soldiers to go mad, and despite the initial enthusiasm for the war on all sides, it didn't take long for mutinies to become an issue that threatened the war effort. The condition of being stuck together in such dire circumstances also helped several of these men to bond in ways they had never had before, which would have numerous social and political effects once the war had concluded. Many of these soldiers would be responsible for forming fascist paramilitary leagues in the decades following the war, while others would join labor unions. Others still turned to pacifism. With the European front stagnant, the Allies worked to attack the Central Powers from other angles. They would begin this strategy by targeting Germany's colonies, and it is here that the Allies faced relative success. British and Australian forces successfully seized German New Guinea, and France and Britain would work to capture Germany's African colonies, which they struggled to defend due to their geographic distance. In total, France conscripted nearly 500,000 Africans over the course of the war, and they formed the backbone of the African theater of the war. Germany too attempted to gain an upper hand through opening more fronts. In response to British seizure of their 2 ships, the declining Ottoman Empire decided to join the war on the side of the Central Powers. This opened a new front in the Middle East, in which French and British troops would invade the Levant from British-held Egypt to attempt to knock Turkey out of the war. Despite all these new fronts opened up by both sides, the long Western Front continued to stalemate, and both sides would devote the rest of the war to attempting to do whatever it took to break the stalemate. The war continued mostly unchanged until early in 1915 when the British attempted a naval invasion of a Turkish heartland near Gallipoli, but the campaign ended in a disaster as 800,000 men on both sides died for nothing. In May, the Allies achieved a major diplomatic victory as the Kingdom of Italy, which had been allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary, agreed to join the war on its side after being promised Austrian territory. The Italians launched an offensive in the Alps, but the nature of fighting in the mountains in addition to the general incompetence of the Italian army also made this front nothing but a stalemate. The Austrians were also incompetent on their part. Despite the major size difference that existed between the two countries, they had been unable to crush Serbia. But that changed once the Central Powers negotiated Bulgarian entry into the war, which finally allowed Serbia and Montenegro to be defeated. This event finally precipitated the fall of the Viviani government, which had come under fire for some time. The failure on the Western Front and the resurrection of top ministers left the government weak. Viviani attempted to fill the empty positions, but everyone he asked refused, and so he resigned on October 27, 1915. He would switch positions with his deputy prime minister Aristide Briand, who would become prime minister again, while Viviani became the deputy. In 1916, Germany would attempt to create its own distraction, when it launched an assault on the French city of Verdun, and what began was the most brutal battle of the war. Perhaps the most brutal battle in all of human history up to that point. Starting in February 1916, the battle would not end until 1 week before Christmas Day. The defense of the city was organized by a certain French general named Philippe Pétain, who made his name here, earning the ceremonial title of Lion of Verdun. On the 1st of July, while Verdun was still ongoing, British troops launched their own offensive in the Somme department, starting an equally brutal battle that lasted until November. Verdun would end in a successful French defense, while the Somme ended up being inconclusive. Overall, the death toll for both of these battles was just shy of 1 million, which equaled 277 deaths every minute and nearly 5 deaths every single second. In the time these battles were occurring, the Entente had managed to negotiate Romanian entry into the war, but they were of little help as they were immediately occupied by Austrian and Bulgarian forces. By 1917, exhaustion over the war was really beginning to set in. Over the previous 2 years, the anti-war faction of the SFIO grew in influence, as its members continued to push for an end to the war, any end of the war, even if it meant that millions of Frenchmen had died for nothing. Life over the war had not just gotten bad for soldiers, but even back in the home front, as the ongoing war led to both a decrease in raw wages and inflationary prices which combined together to form a domestic depression, which further motivated pacifist sentiment. In Parliament, Socialist Deputy Pierre Brisson became the leading voice for peace, and doubt over their support for the government continued to grow among the SFIO. At the end of the Battle of Verdun, Briand had formed a second cabinet, but this one only lasted for 3 months, until his Minister of War General Lyotet resigned on March 14th, which led to his government collapsing. In the leaderless limbo that followed, there were discussions of elevating radical Joseph Caillaux to the prime ministership and having him negotiate a white peace that involved no territorial changes. In the end, though, President Poincaré appointed Alexandre Ribot to the prime ministership, and his government failed to achieve stability. With internal strife, Ribot's government struggled along until October, when everything crashed down following the disastrous Nivelle offensive. Many high-profile politicians, including Georges Clemenceau, would pin the blame for the defeat on Louis Malvy, the Minister of the Interior. The accusations consisted of claims that Malvy had provided military intelligence to the Germans and had fomented several of mutinies that year. These accusations became more dire when in July of that year, a newspaper that Malvy had been subsidizing had been found carrying a 150-franc check to a German bank. Malvy resigned, and he would take down the Ribot government with him. Ribot was replaced by War Minister Paul Painlevé, who himself would only last 2 months in office. His premiership immediately started off on the wrong foot as investiture marked the end of a sacred Union coalition. Over Painlevé refusing to grant socialist deputies passports to attend the International Socialist Peace Conference that had been happening in Stockholm. This would be the least of Painlevé's worries, however, as new revelations came out of the Malvy affair. A letter by the Action Française group would be read on the floor of the House in October that claimed that corrupt links existed between the Minister of the Air and the German High Command, which spurred long debates among parliamentarians. Painlevé would move to have a conversation adjourned, but he would have his request denied, losing a de facto vote of confidence, and he resigned. He was replaced by Georges Clemenceau, who had governed France until the war's end. And in power, Clemenceau would use every ounce of his power he had to stabilize France. He would go after Malvy and others he believed to be hampering the French war effort and had no qualms about ruling by decree. This naturally brought accusation of tyranny from opposing politicians, but this sentiment was not reflected in the French people. They accepted Clemenceau with open arms, happy to see such a confident man leading over them. This confidence even rubbed off on many French soldiers, which provided the army with a crucial morale boost. It wasn't just France that was facing problems with anti-war sentiments, however. In March 1917, the Tsarist government in Russia was overthrown by democratic revolutionaries. A new Republican government was installed, and despite hopes from many Russian citizens that the new government would end the war, the new administration would continue it, hoping to legitimize itself through victory. This, however, failed, and in November of the same year, the government was overthrown by a group of Bolshevik revolutionaries led by a certain Vladimir Lenin. Seeing the writing on the wall, the new government would agree to peace with the Germans, which would result in a brutal Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which Russia would be forced to give up a ginormous amount of territory to the German Empire. With one front knocked out, victory looked almost certain for the Germans, were it not for another blunder they made in early 1917. the United States had stayed neutral throughout the early stages of the war, but since the beginning they had made their preference known to the Allies, with American merchant ships delivering supplies to the Allies. This led to German U-boats targeting American shipping to cripple the Allies, which helped to turn the American public against the Central Powers. The ultimate mistake came in April 1917, when Germans would send the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, asking them to attack the United States in order to slow down what the Germans saw as the inevitable American entry into the war. However, the German telegraph line that sent this message ran through London, which allowed the British to intercept the message and show it to the Americans. This was the final straw, and President Woodrow Wilson would ask Congress to declare war upon Germany, and they did so. With Russia out, the Americans were in. As American troops began to pour into Europe, the Germans were faced with the realization that if they wanted to win the war, they would need to knock out the Entente before the might of the United States arrived for the fight. In early 1918, the Germans launched the Spring Offensive in a last-ditch effort to capture Paris and force France and Britain to surrender. However, the attack only served to weaken German troops, and the news of American arrival finally served to boost the morale of the French and British forces, enough so that the Germans were being pushed back meaningfully for the first time since the beginning of the war. As more American troops arrived, the German situation became more and more tenuous as the country continued to be pushed back. It did not bode well for the Central Powers on the other fronts. In the Middle East, the British forces successfully managed to push up the Levant into Ottoman territory, which led to the Empire suing for peace. From Greece, which had joined the Allies in 1917, Entente forces would also successfully push into Bulgaria, prompting that country to surrender as well. In the front in the Alps, battalions would finally achieve a major breakthrough into Austrian territory, which with the impeding falling apart of the empire led to the new Emperor Charles I agreeing to peace. By the start of November 1918, these events now just left Germany standing alone against the combined might of France, Britain, and America. On November 9, 1918, Allied forces would finally push into core German territory, and Emperor Wilhelm, seeing defeat as imminent, abdicated his throne. 2 days later, the new German Republican government would surrender to the Allies. While the war was not entirely over for the majority of the soldiers involved, it practically was. The main threat had finally been eradicated. Peace was here. At last. For millions in France, the reconquest of Alsace-Lorraine had been the main purpose of the war, and so French soldiers reveled as they rolled into the region in December. The lost provinces had finally been reclaimed. The November armistice did not bring lasting peace, however, and that would only be brought by the Paris Peace Conference, which opened in January 1919. The conference would quickly become the greatest international gathering in history up to that point, with 30 entire countries sending their delegates to attend. France, along with Belgium, was going into the conference with a bloodthirsty revenge. There were many in French leadership who wished to see Germany entirely dismantled, with there being several plans brought forward during the war to have the country effectively divided between French, British, and Russian influence. However, Britain and especially the United States worked to rein in France's extreme demands, wishing a more diplomatic peace. It is necessary to remember that Germany had not been entirely defeated, and thus the Allies were not in a position to unilaterally enforce any peace deal they wanted onto the Germans. What the conference came back with was the Treaty of Versailles, which was harsh, but nowhere near as harsh as it could have been, and less harsh than even the treaty Germany had imposed upon Russia the year prior. To run through the effects of the treaty quickly, since I'm guessing most of you know what it did, the treaty officially ceded Alsace-Lorraine to France, and Germany would be forced to give up a large swath of land to the newly created Polish Republic. In addition, Germany would be forced to give up much more territory over the following year to other countries from plebiscites conducted. The entirety of the German colonial empire was also carved up between France, Britain, Belgium, and Japan. Also, the German Rhineland would be placed under occupation for 15 years, with a small chunk of it being broken off entirely to be given to France as a protector, although it would be returned to Germany in 1935. This said, the Rhineland would also be forcibly demilitarized, even after returning it to Germany. The size of the German armed forces was limited to just 100,000 men, and Germany would be banned from having an air force altogether. The most famous part of the treaty, though, was the heavy war reparations it imposed on the country of 132 billion marks, although the Allies only expected Germany to be able to pay back 50 billion of those marks. There are also smaller treaties for the 3 other countries that fought the war on Germany's side. Austria-Hungary would be dealt with in 2 treaties. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye dealt with the Austrian half, while the Treaty of Trianon dealt with the Hungarian half. These 2 treaties would, like Versailles, severely dismantle the empire, with many new countries being born out of a mess that followed the empire's fall. Financial indemnities and limits on army sizes were also imposed. Next was the Treaty of Neuilly, which dealt with Bulgaria, which for the preceding year had been entirely under British occupation. The treaty required Bulgaria to cede territory to Serbia and Greece, and to relinquish a claim it had on Romanian land. The treaty, like the 2 others, also limited the size of the Bulgarian army and expected 100 million pounds of war reparations. The last treaty was the Treaty of Sèvres, which dealt with the Ottoman Empire. The treaty put nearly the entire Middle East under French and British control, but more importantly, it would severely carve up Turkish lands. It did so to an extent the Turks could not accept, and thousands of Turks rose up against the Allies, who being so exhausted from the war would bow to Turkish demands and tone down the territorial losses, which gave Turkey almost its modern borders. And right there, that is the history of the First World War. It may have been condensed and simplified at parts, especially when it came to the treaties, but this is the general chronology that guided Europe from the years 1914 to 1919. The war may have ended, but that did not mean it failed to leave its lasting mark on history, which we can feel even to this day. Millions had died in hopes of remaking Europe in their nation's image, and in doing so had helped forge a Europe that closely resembles the one we have today. Many countries would recognize over their existence at the conclusion of this war, and the trauma left on both the soldiers who risked so much for their countries and everyday civilians would cause effects that would spread throughout epochs. The war may have been won, but it would be up to this generation of European leaders to win the peace as well.